Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome everyone to this session on how to ensure a positive development impact of a future investment facilitation for development agreement. The session has been jointly organized by the German Development Institute, DIE, and International Trade Center, ITC. My name is Rajesh Agarwal. I am Acting Director of the Division for Market Development, ITC, and will be moderating the session today. As we know, the global foreign direct investment flows have declined by 35% in 2020, and the drop seems to continue in 2021. With the new COVID-19 strain spreading across the world, economic outlook is not looking optimistic for the coming months. Now, with the decreasing amount of FDI, competition in attracting FDI increases. There is not much that the governments can do about attracting investment, especially in the current context, where much of government resources have to focus on pandemic relief. However, one thing that the governments can do is to make investment-related processes easier and investment-related information more transparent. All of these are in the draft text of the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, currently being negotiated at the WTO. The negotiation is making good progress with the aim of concluding them by the end of 2022. Just this week, 8 more members have decided to join this initiative, bringing the total number of participants to 110, which is more than 2/3 of the WTO membership. A positive outcome from these negotiations can help countries improve their investment climate and boost confidence of businesses and investors. One key issue in the negotiations, as its title suggests, is, and I emphasize, for development. This agreement needs to contribute not only to more investment, but more investment that can contribute to sustainable development. Therefore, in the session today, we will talk about what key development-related provisions are there in the current draft, what kind of technical assistance and capacity building would be useful to support developing and the least developed countries to benefit from the future agreement, and how to develop a pro-development agenda on investment facilitation at the WTO. We have put up a remarkable panel of experts for this session. I don't think I need to say much about their experiences as their bios are included in the invitation. We will have Valeria Mendes Costa, First Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Brazil, who will discuss key development-related provisions in the current IFD draft. Zoriana Oleksiuk, Senior Researcher at the German Development Institute, who will address the role of gap analysis, needs assessment, and technical assistance and capacity building in implementing the future agreement. And Mr. Carl Suwong, Resident Senior Fellow, Columbia University, CSI, who will elaborate on how a pro-development agenda of Investment Facilitation Committee could look like. The session will conclude with remarks from Axel Berger, Senior Researcher at the German Development Institute. We hope that the discussion will be as interactive as possible. Please feel free to submit your questions and comments through the question and answer function. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to our first speaker today, Valeria Mendes Costa, to speak about key development-related provisions in the current IFD draft. Valeria, you have 5-6 minutes to make your case.
Thank you so much, Professor. I want to thank the ITC and the DIE also for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel. Well, I've been asked to talk about the key development-related provisions in the current investment facilitation agreement draft. And we are now in the revised Easter text is now in its 5th version. And this 5th version contains some development-related provisions. Of course, the preamble of the agreement contains direct references to sustainable development. And the purpose of the agreement as well is to improve transparency, streamline procedures and other investment measures but as a means of facilitating the flow of investment, particularly to developing and least developed country members, with the aim of sustainable development. So if there were only these two provisions in the agreement, we would already be able to say that the interpretative frame of the future agreement will be informed by this concept. But of course, that's not all. There are also other provisions that we expect to have a significant development impact. First, I want to highlight the domestic supplier database provision, which was a proposal by Brazil, among others. In this provision, the members are encouraged to promote the establishment of this database with the aim of making available to investors and persons seeking to invest information on possible domestic suppliers, including small and medium-sized enterprises. Therefore, the objective is to promote the linkage between foreign firms and domestic suppliers. This is an important tool to reduce the information gaps and search costs for identifying local suppliers, and has an important impact on the domestic supplier chains. We hope to have an important impact on the domestic supplier chain. The agreement also contains a whole section on sustainable investment, which contains provisions on responsible business conduct and measures against corruption. On RBC, of course, the idea is to encourage investors and enterprises to incorporate into their business and internal policies, principles and standards of RBC. And I consider this provision very important because this provision aims to sign the type of investment that members want to receive, and is also a reminder of the shared responsibility of investors and home countries in the successful or a long-term investment relationship. Regarding measures against corruption, we had some proposals on the table. One of them was a very detailed and comprehensive text. So far, the discussions and the consensus that have emerged are around a shorter provision. This, of course, does not mean that members are not interested in this topic. On the contrary, we all know its importance. We know that corruption affects high and low income countries. But given the specificities of this topic and also the need to keep a balance among different sections of the agreement, members are inclined to go with the more streamlined provisions. But nonetheless, we will have a provision on measures against corruption in the text. We also have a large section on special and differential treatment and on implementation. We had this second semester, this semester in the WTO web seminar with ONGs and researchers, and one of the topics, and the topic was precisely this, the implementation, the difficulties regarding implementation, especially for developing countries. And if I'm not mistaken, a presentation by a colleague from the World Economic Forum pointed out that this agreement will pose an implementation burden on developing countries. This colleague from the World Economic Forum made a survey assessing the intensity of the technical assistance needed to implement the agreement, and the different provisions were rated from 1 to 5, and they were all of them classified 4 and 5, which means that really we will have an implementation will be challenged, especially for developing countries. So technical assistance, capacity building, and flexibility to implement the agreement will be crucial for the success of this negotiation and implementation of the agreement. So these are the provisions with some degree of consensus that are still in the agreement. There are other 2 provisions that are in discussion right now. One member proposed a wording on a supplier development program as a complement to the domestic supplier database. The idea, of course, is to increase the number of local firms that could contract with foreign investors, help them to be liquid ready. And there's another proposal made by another member on home state obligations. Right? The idea again is to say that home states have a role to play in facilitating the flow of sustainable investments. I don't want to judge the outcome of this negotiation right now, especially considering that this negotiation will continue next year. But personally, I don't think that these two provisions, these two last provisions that I mentioned, will fly, unfortunately. So to conclude and to leave some time for the discussion afterwards, I just want to say that the sustainable development dimension is present on the Investment Facilitation Agreement. I personally think that these provisions are few and limited in ambition, but I don't want to finish on a great tone here today. Of course, other provisions and other improvements to current articles could have been included. And if time permits, I can mention that during the discussions. But the point is, given the expectations of the majority of members for this agreement, I think that to have development provisions in this agreement is already an important achievement, and the development provisions in the text should not be overlooked. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valeria. I encourage all participants to please keep posting your comments or questions. Now I'll invite Zoriana to elaborate on the role of gap analysis, needs assessment, and technical assistance capacity building in implementing this agreement. Zoriana, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, Valeria, for already showing us how important the agreement is and what it covers. Let me please share a couple of charts with you. So yeah, as we know that there is quite big progress on the agreement, and it's actually high time to reflect on the implementation of a future agreement, the challenges the countries may have, and support that they needed to overcome those challenges. My presentation today is based on a recently updated version of our Investment Facilitation Index, which quantifies level of adoption of over 100 of investment facilitation measures at country level for over 140 WTO members. So it's quite a lot where we could find the data for. I will develop my presentation in 3 steps, and I would like to start with the current level of adoption of different investment facilitation measures across country groups. According to our data set, there is a strong correlation between level of development or income and adoption, or if you want to say non-adoption, of investment facilitation measures. Looking at this spider web, which displays the key policy areas of investment facilitation, you see that the low-income countries have fewer investment measures in place. And this is very important, in particular, if we discuss their likely challenges to implement a future IFD agreement. Coming to the second step, we observe here the reform gaps countries face with the signing of the IFD agreement, right? First of all, what you can see here in the gray bars is the current level of adoption, just like in the previous chart, but for single countries of our data set. And it's the same picture because on the left-hand side, you have the developing countries with quite low levels of implementation, right? Now, in addition, you have this red and orange bars, which show the potential scenarios of the agreement, right? And for example, the red one shows difference to the binding measures, that are in a binding language in the current draft, and the orange one covers both binding and best endeavor measures. So you see that especially the left-hand countries, they face difficulties, and they have a quite high reform pressure to be able to implement those binding and non-binding measures. At the same time, this higher reform pressure also implies higher benefits from an IFD agreement for developing countries. And our further CGE modeling that we've done based on the index show that especially developing countries would benefit a lot because they start from the low level of current implementation. But this will happen only if countries are able to implement the provisions, and many of them need support. And now we come to the actually third step of the presentation. In order to identify the concrete support needs, we have to zoom in what could happen actually at country level. Here we compare the adoption of different investment facilitation measures by an example country X, least developed country X, with the provisions most likely to be adopted in the future IFD agreement. The green lines are the measures from the IFD agreement the country X already adopts, meaning that there is no additional reform needed to implement that. And in this case, for this example, country X, we see that around 20 measures are already implemented that are part of the agreement. For example, inter-agency coordination, establishment of inquiry point, advanced publication of drafts of investment regulations, and others. The orange and red lines are more challenging. Here, the investment framework of country X is inconsistent with the IFD agreement. That's why we call it IFD minus. The orange lines refer to best endeavor provisions and the red ones to binding provisions that are not yet implemented. For this example, we can see that around 15 best endeavor measures, the orange ones, are not yet implemented. The example is, for example, electronic payment of fees, online portals for submission of applications, and many others. For the binding measures, there are around 13 that are not implemented, and they include application information regarding status of the application process, or the focal point, for example, response to inquiries. As you can see from this example, there are challenging measures that require administrative capacity, political will, as well as technical and financial resources for implementation. This is quite understandable why these measures are not yet implemented, especially for developing countries. And that's why I would argue that a firm and substantial technical assistance provision should be put in place and enable countries to sign up to the agreement and implement this agreement in the future. Furthermore, we need a clear picture where countries stand and what kind of support they need. I would therefore argue in favor of detailed gap analysis and needs assessment to be conducted during the negotiation phase, and our index database can be a base for further research and needs assessment in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoriana. Zoriana, if I may ask you one question.
Sure.
You know, in one of your slides, I saw that even very advanced countries like Switzerland, UK, Canada, Finland, they are also not fully compliant with the provisions as they exist in the draft agreement. If you could give us an idea of which are those kind of, provisions which still are not implemented by even countries at this level of development.
Yeah, I do not want to go to very detailed granular measures, but just to show you the big picture, we see here the line for the high income countries. They're kind of the broadest, right, in the spider web. And you can see that in most of cases, that's the focal point in review, the policy area where mainly also high income countries have some deficits and gaps. And that is actually what Brazil's proposal was very broad about the focal point and the different functions of the focal point that can be, you can have different names of it, right? But the point is that the focal point has lots of different functions that are not still present even in the high income countries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other comment or question as yet. So now I'll turn to Carl to address how could a pro-development agenda of an investment facilitation committee look like. Carl, you have the floor, sir.
Thanks a lot, Rajesh, and good day to everyone. Let me, before actually going into the topic, let me just underline one thing that Valeria said, which I thought is very important, namely that if the investment facilitation agreement would come into force today, it would actually be the first time that a WTO agreement has as its objective, in other words, not just in the preamble, but as its objective, to facilitate sustainable, to encourage or to support sustainable development, and in this particular context of the agreement, to do so by facilitating foreign direct investment. And I think that's quite significant. Now, let me turn to the question I'm supposed to address, namely a possible agenda. Obviously, the agenda should be guided by the overall task of an investment facilitation committee, which the agreement foresees will be established. And the overall objective is, of course, is to further the objectives of the investment facilitation agreement. If I understand correctly, but Valeria can perhaps clarify that, there is no concrete final text on what the objective is, but according to the Brazil proposal, the purpose of this agreement is to create a better investment environment and hereby lay down the necessary arrangement for the facilitation of foreign direct investment for development. So that, if I understand, is the overall objective of the agreement, regardless of what the concrete language is at the moment. Now, in this context, I think we need to remember that foreign direct investment on balance contributes, like all investment, to development. In fact, while in fact, you cannot imagine that you will have sustainable development without investment. Investment is not everything, of course, but everything is without investment. So facilitating FDI flows through reasonable measures makes eminent sense. And in this context, talking about reasonable measures, I would distinguish between, and we are distinguishing within the framework of the ITC DIE project, between indirect and direct investment facilitation measures. Indirect measures are measures like increasing transparency. By increasing transparency, presumably you facilitate the flow of more investment, which in turn would help development. Direct investment facilitation measures that not only facilitate the flow of foreign direct investment, but directly contribute to the development effort of the host country. And an example is the measure that Valeria mentioned about supplier development programs, because supplier development programs helps upgrade domestic firms, which after all are the bedrock of development, to be internationally competitive. So this distinction, I think, is important, and I will try to pay special attention to this type of measures in my presentation today. Now, let me talk more specifically about a possible agenda. And of course, you know, this is all at the moment conjecture, but we have to plan for it because, as Rajesh mentioned, the idea is to finish the negotiations by the end of 2022, and therefore some of these issues will come up in the following year. And I want to distinguish between, this is of course a loose distinction, between process tasks and substantive tasks, and give some examples for each of them. Now, the process tasks involve things, basically housekeeping matters like rules of procedures, how the format for accession notification should be look like, a question of whether there should be a periodic review and things like that. I don't have to elaborate on that. Now, a more important procedural question, I think, concerns the coordination of technical assistance and capacity building. Soriana has made reference to the importance of technical assistance and capacity building. And I think it's very important indeed, and in fact more important than in the case of the trade facilitation agreement, because after all, investment facilitation doesn't stop at the border, but involves the entire life cycle of an investment project. And that means it's highly complicated, which is also reflected in the agreement itself by having all sorts of measures that are really not border measures, but concern activities within the host country itself. So I think we might want to discuss that a bit later, but I think there is agreement that a strong commitment, a strong and firm commitment for technical assistance is needed. And the third item I want to mention under process is guidelines for the implementation of the agreement. And Soriana mentioned gap analysis and needs assessment. Very important, because these guidelines obviously should pay special emphasis, put special emphasis on measures that not only increase FDI flows, but also directly increase the development impact of foreign direct investment. So all these process issues are important, and I think we need to keep in mind when thinking about an agenda for an investment facilitation committee that in doing so and in preparing the agenda, we should pay special attention to measures that directly increase the development impact of foreign direct investment, because they are the most important one from a host country perspective. Now let me turn to substantive task, what one could sort of call the committee's deliberative function. Well, I think the first one here is to deal with a built-in agenda. And I assume there will be one. I have no clue whether there will be, but I assume there will be one. And I think it's a good thing to have one, because it might help actually arriving at an agreement, because issues that could not be resolved right now could be put into the built-in agreement agenda. But it also provides a mandate to continue negotiations of specific issues. So it's important to see what could go into a built-in agenda. And of course, an obvious set of issues concerns topics on which no consensus could be reached so far in the negotiations. And there are a number of them, like silence is consent, business obstacles, alert mechanism, risk-based assessments. All of these are ideas that have been proposed in the context of the negotiations. Now, unfinished business, however, also includes various measures that have also already been suggested during the negotiations, but that have not yet been included. And I'm talking about measures that not only facilitate FDI flows, but also directly increase the development impact. Valeria mentioned one, supplier development programs. Very important, because supplier development programs or linkage programs upgrade domestic firms. And of course, linking such development programs to supplier databases is a very good idea, because it increases the effectiveness of supplier development programs. The idea of a special category of recognized sustainable investor has been proposed. It would follow the model of the trade facilitation agreement, which has a special category of the authorized operator. And the idea is basically to incentivize investors by offering them additional facilitation measures in return for committing themselves to make special efforts to contribute to sustainable FDI and sustainable development. As far as I'm concerned, an investment facilitation for development agreement should go at least as far as a trade facilitation agreement. In fact, maybe it should go further, given that in the meantime, we have learned quite a lot. Another example of a measure which I think should be put into a built-in agenda are ex-ante sustainable development impact assessments. I'm not talking here about environmental or social assessments, which are also important, but I'm talking here specifically about ex-ante sustainable development impact assessment of large projects. May not make sense for small projects, but for large projects, for instance, the mining sector, it would make sense. And then finally, there is the idea of perhaps having the designation of a responsible business conduct coordinator to facilitate investor relations with local stakeholders. And not to forget another set of issues, which was mentioned by Valeria, and I'm just underlining it, is home country obligations. Home country obligations in terms of increasing the transparency of the measures they take in order to support the outward investors, but also the type of measures they take in order to make sure that the outward investment they support actually contributes reasonably to sustainable development, or is reasonable, sustainable foreign direct investment. There are more measures which we have developed in the context of the ITC DIE project, and we just issued the second edition of this inventory of investment facilitation measures. And Yaden, if you're on the Zoom call, maybe you can put the link into the chat box. One final thought: this may not be for the built-in agenda, but who knows? Would be topics that have not so far been suggested in the negotiations, and which would be relevant and which will become increasingly relevant. And I'm thinking here in particular, the question of the promotion of green foreign direct investment. We have done a little perspective on that, and maybe you can put the link on that, yeah, then in the chat box as well. So that's a whole complex of development-oriented measures, which I think ought to go into a built-in agenda for the committee to deal with. Let me just mention two more things without going into much detail, because I'm sorry I've spoken already too long. The second substantive matter is exchange of experiences gained with the implementation of the agreement. What works? What doesn't work? Which measures are particularly important? What are good practices? Where are technical assistance and capacity building gaps? We have to keep in mind that many IPAs have very small budgets, between $1 and $2 million in most cases, sometimes even below $1 million. So capacity building and gaps may be particularly important. And then finally, another deliberative function is namely seeing whether any of the rules or any of the provisions of the agreement need clarification in light of experience. Obviously, you know, as the agreement is being implemented, all sorts of new issues will come up, and obviously the committee would then be the forum where these things are being discussed. So to conclude, there are plenty of opportunities to explore measures that not only increase FDI flows, but at the same time strengthen the development impact. And I think it would be desirable if as many of such direct development-oriented measures as possible could be included in a built-in agenda. And that's, of course, up to the delegates. And I just can say, I hope that they will take this opportunity. As I mentioned, the ITC DIE project on investment facilitation for development has identified a number of these measures and brought them to the attention of the negotiators. And I'm pretty sure that the host of this meeting, IISD, does the same thing in the framework of its project to help developing countries in the WTO investment facilitation negotiations. This is a very important task indeed, and let's keep our fingers crossed that delegates will arrive at a very good built-in agenda and more broadly work program for the Investment Facilitation Committee. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. In the meantime, Yarden has very efficiently put all these papers, shared all these papers through the link. Please, I request and encourage all participants to, look at those papers. They are extremely good and very rich in information content. In the meantime, we have received one very important question, which is obviously the less developed countries may be restricted by limited financial resources. Now, let me try to rephrase this question. See, we have already discussed about the desirable measures which can encourage development in this process. Now, those of you who are close to the negotiations and listening to this debate in the committee every day, what is your sense of the readiness of the richer members of the club to encourage implementation of whatever is negotiated and whatever commitments are undertaken? And obviously, if there is readiness on their part to encourage implementation, they will be more willing to link it with technical assistance, as we saw in the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Or would your sense, I'm just trying to now put the upside down, that the sense of the richer countries is that, okay, we are negotiating something which is benefiting the developing countries. So it is focusing attention of these countries to bring about these reforms, but leave them free to choose their times, whenever they have the resources and the will to implement those reforms. So in that sense, and whatever the function you give to the committee later on, whether it's a rather strong monitoring function, if it is linked with technical assistance to be provided to encourage implementation, or it is likely to be a soft agreement which just focuses attention of the countries towards desirable outcomes. So I would just like to get that sense from those who are close to these negotiations. Valeria.
I think
yes,
you're looking
I know.
exactly.
Yeah, they are looking at me. Wow. I don't want to sound pessimistic, as I said before, but let me try not to be pessimistic, right? I think that there's a commitment to help developing countries to implement the agreement, but the language as a whole in the whole IFD agreement is more of an encouragement language than binding obligations, unfortunately. And this applies also to technical assistance and capacity building, unfortunately. So I think that, as I said before, for many countries, the expectations regarding this agreement was mainly about facilitating the flows, right? Was about transparency, was about streamlining procedures, and the development dimension was quite, in my personal view, was quite left behind. And the development dimension only emerged very recently, I would say this year, this semester. Because on one side, for the majority of countries, it was only about transparency and streamlining procedures. And for the other side, the developing countries only engaged in the discussions very lately, late in the process. So I think the development dimension has been left behind. Some countries have helped to remember. Brazil was one of them. In almost every plenary session in Brazil, reminded members that we were negotiating an agreement, an investment facilitation agreement for development. We have made many proposals regarding development, very ambitious proposals even for Brazil, but Brazil proposed them nonetheless. And what we have seen through the negotiations, during the negotiations, was a shrinking of these proposals. And what we have on the text now is really the minimum that we could have expected at the beginning, really. For me, it's a little bit frustrating, but I don't, as I said before, and I will reiterate again, I don't want to be pessimistic, totally pessimistic. I think that to have this kind of provisions is already an improvement, is already a victory. And I hope, as Carl mentioned, that the investment committee can build, that the members can agree on an investment committee agenda that reminds members of the need to further negotiate provisions, development-related provisions. I sincerely hope that. I sincerely hope. Let's see.
Thank you. Any other views?
Rajesh, if I may?
Yes, please.
Obviously, I'm not close to the negotiations, so all that I can provide is observations. So my first observation is that, I mean, the fact that this is the most inclusive plurilateral negotiation we currently have at the WTO, very much supported by developing countries, shows, first of all, that developing countries are willing to, reform their investment frameworks, to make them more transparent, predictable, and so on. So that's one side of the coin, right? And then the other side of the coin is what also I observe is that many developed countries, call them donors or whatever, are very much interested in supporting private investments to developing countries, right? I mean, you have the G20 compacts with Africa. In Germany here, we have a program on where we work with reform partners, right? That are willing to reform their investment frameworks, and we provide assistance. So there's a lot of interest among donors, among developed countries to really support these kind of reforms. And I see a strong overlap, right, between, for example, the agenda and the G20 compact and the IFD negotiations. I would really encourage donors to make use of this multilateral process to really support developing countries. And so, well, I think that some matchmaking is needed, I guess, between these two observations. But perhaps I'm a bit more optimistic than Valeria, and I think it's in the process of implementation, as we've discussed with the needs assessments and so on. I think this kind of matchmaking should take place.
Thank you, Axel. Carl, you want to say something?
Yes, I also want to respond to this question, and pretty much along the same lines as Valeria and Axel. I mean, the proof of the pudding of an agreement is an implementation. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And implementation is going to be difficult. We know that. I think the data that were presented by Soriana show that there is a great need for capacity building and technical assistance. So technical assistance and capacity building will be key if the agreement should be a successful agreement. Now, and that starts already now with the need to do needs assessments and gap analysis, the type of thing that is being done in the framework of the project of DIE. Because after all, I think it's pretty much agreed already that countries will self-designate the pace at which they will introduce certain reforms. And of course, it's in the interest of everybody, including the countries involved, of course, to make that process as rapidly as possible. If countries say we can only implement this in 15 years, my God, by that time, things might have changed completely. So the question of firm commitments on technical assistance and capacity building is key, and I hope that, Valeria, you won't give up on pushing for that and convincing your colleagues to make commitments in this direction. Now, having said that, we do, I guess, know from the experience of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which does not have any firm commitments for technical assistance, that indeed quite as developed countries in particular, but donor countries in general, countries in a position to do so, have contributed quite considerably to technical assistance for trade facilitation. I seem to recall that the EU alone has literally talked about billions of dollars in this respect. So my guess is that that it is better that there will be technical assistance forthcoming, but obviously it would be much better for everyone if there were a firm commitment. In this context, Rajesh, you were, after all, one of the key negotiators of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. What was the experience with the technical assistance capacity building discussion in that in the context of the Trade Facilitation Agreement? And if I remember correctly, actually, even while the negotiations were still ongoing, needs assessments were taking place, which in turn helped the negotiations process. But you are the one who were there, so maybe you can say a few words about it.
Now, Carl, I mean, you are absolutely right. Let me try to share and also end on a more optimistic note, before I pass on the floor. It is that, trade facilitation to some extent, if we go to the earlier history of negotiations, was considered by many developing countries to be a market access negotiations in which the major exporters will have interest in reforming trade facilitation practices in developing countries to push or to make it easy to export goods, which has a little different connotation in terms of the encouragement which can be given to the developing countries to reform. It is, the debate has turned on in the last 20 years that we first started discussing that, the value chains, the imports are also equally important if you want to be competitive. And that is gaining ground. And that is why developing countries want to reform on their own also. Whether that kind of a thing about integrating into value chains and considering imports also to be made easy and cost competitive so that, we can be export competitive. Can that linkage be also foreseen in an investment facilitation agreement? That's the kind of issue that we need to debate. Second, I get a very clear sense from what Valeria is saying, what Axel has said, and you have said, that there is, in the broader aid for trade agenda, there is willingness on the part of the richer countries to aid these kind of reforms in developing and the least developed countries. But maybe it is not showing in that context, in the limited context of one agreement that's also a plurilateral agreement. Now, I want to also share that currently ITC, my own organization, is drafting, we are at the last stage, is the strategic plan for the next 4 years. And we sent around a questionnaire asking for what kind of assistance they would need. Frankly, I was also surprised to see the response that majority of the countries now, they want actually assistance on reforming their business and investment climate, even from an organization like ITC, which I could not have thought that such a demand would come, 15 years or 10 years ago when I was there. So a lot of attention is being given to this subject of the facilitatory investment climate and the business climate. And there is general willingness on the part under the broader aid for trade agenda, how far we can make all collectively together, in the context of these negotiations, to focus this attention through the WTO process, which becomes more important in terms of delivery of assistance. Any views? Anybody who wants to? I don't see other questions. Any comments, Carl?
Rajesh, there's a question in the chat from Quan Chao.
Okay, that's addressed to Carl. That is, could you please elaborate on the guidelines for implementation that you mentioned? What format could those guidelines take, and in which areas such guidelines could be most useful? Carl?
Thank you. Well, I mean, obviously the agreement as it is shaping up is going to be very complex and we'll have a lot of very technical details. Oh, and let me say in this context, just to clarify one thing. The agreement, I know practically everybody knows it, but I say just to clarify things, the agreement is dealing really entirely with technical measures related to the facilitation of investment. Technical measures related to facilitate investment. It doesn't deal with the question of what policies countries should follow. It doesn't deal with these more controversial issues like market access, protection, or investor-state dispute settlements. That's explicitly and deliberately left out. So we are talking about technical measures. And of course, these technical measures are complicated. It's the nature of technical measures. So my guess is that at one point, the committee will have to develop guidelines how to implement the agreement. That starts, I would think, but Valeria might be able to tell us more about that. And Axel, you have the experience in the context of the project. It probably begins with how do you do a gap analysis? How do you assess the needs that you actually have in terms of implementing the various measures that the agreement entails? And at the same time, if it is self-designation in terms of the pace of implementation, what can you do relatively fast and what needs much more time and resources and experience and human resources, not only financial resources? So I think guidelines would have to identify, these would have to address this type of questions. And of course, I would assume they will have to be revised in light of experience as we go along and see that certain things may be more difficult than others. One might have to amend them in the future. So this is what I would consider sort of as the basic elements of guidelines. But as I said, Valeria and Axel, maybe you can elaborate that. And I know, Rajesh, that in the context of the trade facilitation agreement, there was all sorts of follow-up by the Secretariat, and actually ITC has considerable experience in helping countries implement the trade facilitation agreement. So maybe you could provide some guidance as to what the guidelines should contain.
Yes, Valeria.
Yes. Well, if I may, Carl, once again, I don't want to sound pessimistic. I'm being repetitive, but I think for this we will need really the help of ITC and DIE and other organizations, to help countries to make this assessment. Because from my experience in the WTO, I think the committees in the WTO, they are very, how can I put it? The WTO functions with this mantra, this member-driven mantra, and committees, they are always reluctant to go further their mandate, even of course, development is in the objective of the agreement. I personally feel, this is my personal view, that committees in the WTO, they are very reluctant to propose measures by their own. They always rely on members. If the members don't put proposals on the table, committees are reluctant to do so. So I think that for much of this work that has to be done, we will need to count on organizations such as yours. That's my personal view.
Thank you. Let me also add from our experience of implementation of the trade facilitation agreement. I think we should not undermine or see that the role of focusing attention on something because there is an agreement in WTO is less. And also do not discount the role which private sector plays in all these countries in trying to push their governments to reform. They have always wanted these reforms, but have never been able to articulate them in a manner that they can impress upon their governments and focus their attention. And suddenly they find that there is a WTO agreement which they like, and it gives them the voice and ideas to articulate their own demands to their governments and try to get it addressed. I think that particular function is extremely important, and all the gap analysis that Zorana has been talking about is an extremely important component of that articulation process of the private sector, as well as also lobbying or advocacy, which they can do with their governments. Now, supply development programs, whether they find a place in the WTO agreement or not is one aspect, but supply development will be extremely important for the backward linkages to be developed and for the exact development impact of any investment attraction. And therefore, even if it is not part of the agreement, yet it will be part of the conversation in the domestic environment, in the national environment. And any effort, whether it is through the donor's contribution or of the government through its own budget, by just, they have the money, but, it has not been prioritized to this sector. This will in itself be an extremely important contribution of the agreement. That is what is our experience, of implementation of the trade facilitation agreement, actually. So I just thought that I will also emphasize on this role that, it is a self-generating and, everything is put into the loop and then it becomes self-serving from a private sector driven agenda for these reforms. Carl, you want to say something?
Well, just to introduce a small note of caution to what you just said, Rajesh, in terms of relying or hoping that the private sector in host countries will push the government to move forward on investment facilitation. And the small footnote I have there is, I could imagine that there are many companies in many host countries that are not necessarily enthusiastic about having more international competition come into their own backyard and into their own markets. So but at the same time, I agree with you, of course, that an agreement would be a tool for those forces in host countries that want to move ahead. But I see these forces less so in the private sector, and more so, unless it's a private sector that is involved in outward investment, because then they have a particular interest in it. But I would see them more in the form of the investment promotion agencies, which would probably like to be able to say, look, we have to implement this agreement, and for that, we ought to facilitate certain things, streamline administrative practices, increase transparency, have supplier development programs and things like that. So there may be different camps in the private sector of host countries. Some of them may be all for an investment facilitation agreement, while others may have more reservations. Anyway, it's just speculation on my part.
No, thank you so much. We will take this debate forward. Axel, you want to say something?
Of course, yes. Thank you very much, Rajesh, for highlighting the domestic dimension of the whole thing. I would like to draw your attention to the kind of agreements that Brazil is negotiating, right? The bilateral FIAs. They are called facilitation and cooperation agreements. So I think we should also not forget the cooperation or coordination aspect, right? Cooperation on an international level. Carl talked about it with regard to the useful role a committee at the WTO can play, but we should not forget the cooperation and coordination at the domestic level. So to bring different actors together. Rajesh, you've talked about the business community, the domestic community, obviously it's also the foreign investors, but it's also quite a sizable number of governmental agencies, right? We are talking about investment, many governmental agencies are involved. Ministry of Trade, Planning, Investment, Environment, you name it, right? And investment promotion agencies, chambers of commerce, and so on. So there's quite a big group of stakeholders. Some of our colleagues call them epistemic communities. So it's also at this level where really the implementation, a successful implementation, should happen and take place. And it's also very important that we support such domestic structures that really can help to make it different when it comes to really making the best use of this agreement at the multilateral level, on the domestic level, in support for sustainable development. So I think this cooperation, coordination dimension is really key, and we should not forget it or forget about it.
Thank you. I see another question. Is there any study that assesses how an investment facility would help to make trade facility more effective and maybe lead to a different use of subsidies for trade? Do you get this question? Or Francesca, would you like to explain what do you want to know? Because there is a facility here and you can, I think, speak if you want.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, maybe the question is confusing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering if maybe this new possible facility, sorry if I don't use the right terminology, but it could help to make the facility for trade development. Sorry, I'm probably mixing up the name of the facility, but if we will make it more effective, if we have also a facility that helps in investments for development, that also the other facility for trade then could become more effective, because maybe what we are using as resources, subsidies in the facility for trade development could become more effective, because on the side, there is also another type of facility that helps investment for development. Does it make sense? Sorry about it. Or will there be a study of this kind to see how the two facilities could somehow help each other and make, in the end, a better use of any type of resources we dedicate to them? Thank you.
Excel or Carl, would you like to take it? Or is it that I understand it that what is the role of incentives for investment, for expanding trade? Is the question going in that direction, that, whether there should be investment incentives, given, and whether there can be some change because of investment facilitation, for developing exports or promoting exports?
Well, I'm happy to take a first stab on it. I'm not aware of any particular studies in this respect, Francesca, but there are quite a number of studies on the broader issue of attracting foreign direct investment and how you do that well and things like that. Now, to turn to more to the question which you raised, I would assume that if and when there is a technical assistance fund or arrangement in the context of the Investment Facilitation Agreement, that it would closely work with the people in the trade facilitation context, because as Rajesh mentioned, in the broader context of aid for trade, there have already been some efforts to define trade a bit broader and include some investment issues, at least as far as infrastructure is concerned. So I would assume that there is quite some possibilities for synergies between trade facilitation and investment facilitation. After all, trade and investment are just different sides of the same coin. And given the interrelationships, it just would make sense to do that and cooperate very closely. But since I have the microphone, Rajesh, and we are coming to the end of our session, I was wondering whether I could ask Valeria, as someone who is in the middle of all of this, what's going to happen next now that MC12 has been postponed? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what is planned for the negotiations. I understand there was the idea of a declaration. What can we look forward to?
Well,
Valeria, just 1 second. Before I give you the floor, I see one comment from the European Union, Carlo. Carlo, if you want, after Valeria has spoken, please feel free to even speak in case you wish to do so. Valeria, please go ahead.
No, I was going precisely to mention the comment made by Carlo, who of course knows a lot of this negotiation. And well, I'll leave him to say a few words if you want. Regarding the next steps, yes, we were planning to have a declaration. And now we have already a schedule of meetings for the first semester. Every month we will meet again and continue the negotiation. So that's what we have for the moment. So I think we are going to have a very busy next year, busy to 2022, and we hope to conclude these negotiations in 2022, because after that there's also the whole discussion about how to incorporate this agreement into the legal architecture of the WTO. So I think members really want to finish as soon as possible to have time to discuss how to include this agreement into the legal framework, and then hopefully to have all in place by the next ministerial, or the next one, the other one, not the next, which is still going to be.
Okay, thank you, Valeria. Carlo, you are most welcome to take the floor in case you wish to.
Thank you,
Yes.
Rajesh.
Yes.
So I just wanted to intervene, and thank you very much for this discussion. Extremely interesting. I always follow your seminars, even if I don't intervene, and I learn a lot. No, just wanted to react to the question that Francesca Nunez posed on the question of subsidies, and I mean, linked to that is this additional benefit, I think, that the IFD could provide, which is by improving the level of transparency of all the policies that affect foreign investment, including incentives. And we know that incentives can affect very much the decisions in a good or in a not good way of how foreign investment operates. I think one of the aims should be to improve the level of transparency for these schemes, at least to know what is available. And that's the first step to improving the use of these instruments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carlo. I think we are coming to the end of the session. Before I invite Axel, if I may just, also to Carl, when he said that there may be vested interests which may actually do the negative lobbying rather than the positive lobbying. Maybe not for this discussion, maybe it's I'm just giving this for sounding out for further discussion. Maybe there are sectors where there are more vested interests, and there are sectors technologically more advanced where people would like to get into, the supply chains. So maybe it's a good, kind of a discussion to have at some point in time to see that where there can be more negative impact of the vested interests in the domestic setup and where perhaps there can be more positive impact of the private sector lobbying for reforms. And the Axel, I'll give now the floor to you to conclude the session, give your concluding remarks. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rajesh. I think this is a really difficult position you've put me in, Rajesh, because this was a very rich discussion. So let me try to summarize and highlight some of the key points. But first of all, let me thank IISD for providing this hub. I think this is extremely useful to have such side events, even though the MC did not take place. I think it was a really good platform you've provided throughout this week, and at the same time, let me also thank the participants for their active engagement, even though it's already pretty late, at least here in Europe. And Valeria, you're starting your day, but or in the middle of it, but here in Europe, it's quite late. So we are very happy for the active participation. Thanks very much. So I have 4 key points. First of all, our session, I think, showed that, that there's a rich set of provisions which can directly impact or directly help to have a positive impact on sustainable development and help to promote a sustainable FDI to countries. Some of them, as Valeria highlighted, are already included in the draft text or are being discussed and considered. And obviously, Carl added a couple of additional ideas that could be part of the discussion after the entry into force of the agreement as part of the committee discussion. Carl called it a Builtin Agenda. So first point, there's a rich set of provisions, and I would also like to again draw your attention to the inventory that Carl and colleagues developed. You will find the link in the chat. A rich set of ideas. So the second point, as Soyana highlighted, there are big opportunities for developing countries to really make the best use of this agreement to improve their investment frameworks at the domestic level. Obviously, at the same time, these big opportunities also mean big challenges, because you will only benefit from those measures that you are able to implement and effectively implement. But that's a big point. There are also opportunities for developing countries. A third point, obviously, there's a need for to support implementation, because in the context of such an agreement, which tries to improve regulatory frameworks, you only benefit from the reforms that you do at home, right? So that's the nature of the agreement, and implementation support is very much needed. We can learn a lot from the TFA. Some of these elements are already in the draft when it comes to the special and different treatment aspect, the implementation support. So that's I think that's a good direction the negotiation have taken. But as Carl highlighted and Soyana as well, the need for substantial technical assistance as well, and we would hope that countries in the position to do so, as it called in the text, make a step forward and really say, okay, we would like to propose that and support that, but we would also be optimistic that once the agreement is there, a community of donors, international organizations would step up and support these reforms in developing countries. Obviously, we also discussed the need to do already now during the negotiation process to conduct needs assessments to understand what the challenges and benefits of the agreement are at the domestic level. So that's the point. We need to support implementation. And the fourth point, the committee might play a very important role, the committee at the WTO, to support implementation, to clarify rules, to coordinate and orchestrate the support needed to do the implementation, to exchange best practice experiences, and to discuss about additional provisions that directly have a direct positive impact on sustainable development. So Rajesh, back to you. It's I think it's now time for your concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Axel. It is exactly 5:45 in Geneva in the evening. So what remains for me is to thank IISD for organizing this wonderful webinar, all the panelists and participants for contributing to this rich discussion. Thank you very much. Have a very good day, good night, good evening. Thank you very much.